Welcome back to our podcast, Good Deeds Real Estate with a Mission. I'm Diane Davidson from the Fine Homes Group at Keller Williams, and I'm here with Nicole Quinn, who's going to chat with me today. So today we're going to discuss appraisals, assessments, and inspections, the differences between the three, and then spend some time talking about just appraisals. In future podcasts, we'll be interviewing a home inspector and a town assessor to give you more information on those two things. So, hi Nicole and welcome.
Hi Diane.
How are you today?
I'm great.
Good.
I'm ready to learn.
Okay, well I guess I'm ready to teach. So, assessments. Assessments are evaluation determined by the town or municipality in which the property exists, and they're for purposes of taxing the property. So the assessed value has some correlation to the current value, but
Okay.
it can be higher or lower.
And when you say current value,
The value that you would sell a
Okay.
property for. So
Great.
what a willing buyer would pay today might not be, and probably isn't exactly what your assessed value is, but it's a barometer.
right.
Inspections are usually conducted by a home inspector.
Shocking.
Yeah, exactly. Who's in the business of evaluating sort of the physical plant, if you will, usually after a property is under agreement, usually hired by a buyer, sometimes hired by a seller before putting the property on the market to see what if anything they might need to correct before they get it on the market.
Okay.
So that's the difference. Inspectors hired by a property owner or future property owner. Assessments are done by the municipality in which the property exists, and appraisals are a whole nother thing.
Okay, and appraisals are the one we have a lot of questions about today.
We do,
Yeah.
and hopefully a lot of answers.
I hope so. So is an appraisal always required for every real estate transaction?
No. So if somebody's paying cash, a buyer's paying cash and not borrowing money from a lending institution, they don't necessarily, the buyer themselves don't necessarily require an appraisal. Occasionally they would want one for peace of mind, but in this market we don't see that a lot.
Okay.
Something that happens occasionally, very occasionally, where once the lender submits the loan application, they are given information that an appraisal is not required for that particular property.
Okay.
And I believe that's based primarily on a function of the down payment of the buyer, perhaps the credit. When we have a mortgage originator on with us in a future podcast, we'll get into the details of that.
Okay. Very interesting.
Which is an interesting concept in and of itself, because then, in that case, the bank, I guess, or the lender just has faith that what a willing buyer is going to pay is the actual value.
Right. And so just for people who maybe don't understand what appraisals are for, appraisals are to assure the lender that they're not lending over the value and making a greater risk.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, it's the appraiser's job to sort of certify or validate, if you will, that the price and terms under which a buyer is agreeing to buy the property are fair and not a risk to the lending institution.
Understood.
And they are, an appraiser is an impartial, actually, let me read a little bit of this article that was in New Hampshire Realtor Magazine, actually. So just a quick sentence here. A home appraisal is an impartial professional opinion of how much a home is worth.
Okay, that sums it up, I would say.
Yep. They have very strict guidelines they have to adhere to.
Mm.
So they are looking for 3 comps, so 3 properties that are similar, that have closed within a reasonable amount of time, whether that's 90 days or 6 months or sometimes as far back as a year. But appraisers have to follow these guidelines very strictly. If there's, for instance, a fireplace, it's worth X amount when they're making an adjustment from a comparable sale to the subject property that they're appraising. Their hands are tied as far as how much value they can decrease or increase to adjust the price between the property that they're appraising and the properties that have closed.
So, say in an instance where we're talking about a property in a very small town, what if there are not any comps that have closed within a reasonable amount of time? Do they have more wiggle room as far as how far away from that property they can go to make comparisons?
So they do, and that's when a good appraiser, who knows what they're doing, knows the area, can find the data that they need, whether they go back farther in time, whether they go to surrounding towns. I mean, there are certainly unusual properties in every area, in every town across this country, right? And so they can't always fit in the nice little box that they start out in. They have to start in that in that little box, whether it's square footage, bedroom count, acreage, condition, all of those things play a part, and they're really trying to look for similar property. Style of home.
I think the style of home would have that much to do with the price difference.
The thing is that they don't necessarily, it's hard for them to ignore something that,
Okay.
that we know a buyer says, well, I only want to live in a Cape, and buys a colonial. I want to
True,
live in
yeah.
something, I want a contemporary and buys an antique farmhouse, right?
Right.
But so appraisers though are sort of restricted to certain guidelines, as I said, and so they can't really, if there is something that seems obvious to them
Mhm.
that they need to use because it's the same style of home, they can't necessarily think the same way a buyer thinks. They wouldn't necessarily use data that might be part of a buyer's search and might have driven the buyer to make the decision they make.
So what happens if a buyer makes an offer, the offer is accepted, but the appraisal comes in low?
Lower than the accepted
Lower,
price.
yes.
All sorts of things can happen. First of all, sometimes the buyer can't buy. Financially, they're not able to unless
Mhm.
the property appraises for the agreed upon value or more. Sometimes it's a point of negotiation.
Okay.
In this market, if there is a difference between the appraised value and the agreed upon value, many times buyers will offer to make up the difference with their own cash. Because you see, appraisals are lagging. 90 days ago, what closed 90 days ago or 6 months ago is old news. Our market locally in New Hampshire appreciated 26% in 1 year, right? So
Right.
3 months of that is, I don't know, do the math, is that 6 point something percent?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so if it closed 90 days ago, which means it went under contract somewhere around, maybe as much as 120 days before this particular property is being appraised, that's a lot of money, big difference. And so the appraisals always lag because they're looking at closed data. So the same thing's gonna happen in a declining market. Appraisals will start coming in higher than people agree to pay because appraisers are using numbers of properties, prices for properties that closed months before, and if market's
Mhm.
declining, you end up with a lag in that direction.
Gotcha.
And there are also times when properties appraised for more than a buyer agreed to
And
pay.
then what happens in that scenario?
Usually nothing.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of biased thing, if you will, but sometimes contracts are written that the property must appraise at or above, or the buyer and seller agree to renegotiate, failing which the contract is terminated. It wasn't such a strong seller's market, where it's very competitive for buyers. That was not an uncommon clause to see,
Mm-hmm.
one that we don't really recommend, because the truth is, it's a very sort of one-way way to look at things.
Yeah.
I mean, sellers don't usually, or their agents don't usually write in language that says if it appraises for more, the buyer agrees to pay more. So a buyer has a protection that a seller doesn't have, and it's kind of it's kind of skewed in my opinion.
Interesting.
Mm.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know, because you know why? Because it's the way people have done it for a long time. But honestly, it's not something that we usually suggest,
Uh-huh.
and it's we have, when we're representing the sellers, at times gone back in the course of negotiation and said to, if there's a buyer agent who uses wording that the property must appraise at or above,
Mm-hmm.
failing which the renegotiation and so on, we've countered with, it must appraise at, failing which buyer or seller has the right to renegotiate.
That sounds like a
Which would be
fair
fair,
way to
right?
word that, yeah.
But it rarely happens though.
Yeah.
But most commonly in this market, what happens is that buyers either offer to make up an appraisal gap if there is one,
Uh-huh.
or sellers ask for that in the counter offer, and if a buyer can do it, they usually agree.
And in the instance that they couldn't cover an appraisal gap, the deal just falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's really unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Or they can renegotiate,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I'll tell you, here's a really interesting thing that we learned the hard way about a year ago. And so this sort of speaks to the fact that appraisers, I mean, they really do the best that they can do,
Mm-hmm.
given the parameters and the guidelines that they have to adhere to, because they're licensed, right? And they have a lot on the line. And by the way, appraisals are always reviewed. So when an appraisal comes into the lender, it always goes into appraisal review. Now, rarely does it get challenged, but so with an appraiser, it's not just their eyes looking at it, somebody else is checking it. And again, they're licensed and they adhere to these guidelines, right?
Okay.
But here's one. So an appraiser visits the subject, let's say you're selling 123 Main Street,
Uh-huh.
okay? And they have an appointment to see it on Monday. They come and see it on Monday, they take all the notes, all the pictures. On Wednesday, 125 Main Street closes, it's exactly the same house, painted the same, everything exactly the same, closes Wednesday. The appraiser sits down at their desk to write up the report on Thursday. They can't use that Wednesday closing as a comparable sale because it wasn't closed the day they visited the subject home.
Oh.
Now, you would think that would be the most relevant piece of data that there
Yeah.
could be, right? The
I would
most
think so.
relevant, and yet they can't because it wasn't closed the day. It happened to us. It happened to us in a house in Bedford, New Hampshire,
Mm.
and that's how we learned.
Yeah.
Because we thought the appraiser was like, why were they ignoring the most obvious comp right down the street?
Right.
Because it wasn't closed the day they visited.
Mm.
It was
frustrating.
closed
It's good to
before
know.
they wrote the report. Yeah. So, but that also, I think, speaks to the fact that these appraisals aren't necessarily, because of things like that, aren't necessarily really the most accurate
Right,
valuation.
yeah. It's almost like having like a machine algorithm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
it makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
It takes out the human element.
That's exactly what it does. You know,
Alright.
if there's an extra bathroom, or there's an extra fireplace, or somebody's dying for a home with 3 fireplaces, and there's only 1 fireplace, or there are no fireplaces, and the appraiser assigns, I think it's either $2,500 or $3,500 per fireplace that they make an adjustment. To somebody who has to have 3 fireplaces, or even just one, as the MasterCard commercial says, it's priceless. Zillow said something recently about pet odor, but I don't want to say anything disparaging about pets, but, a computer can't smell, a computer can't hear, a computer can't feel, and we talk about the value, for instance, that property preparation brings to a home,
Right.
or staging, if you wanna call it that, or
We
first
did a
impression.
whole episode about that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but a computer can't factor that in, right?
Right.
Only human beings can.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing about appraised values, it looks really primarily at the numbers
Mm,
and the physical features, and not the terms.
okay.
So if, for example, somebody, a buyer was making an offer on a home, and they offered $850, and they wanted to close in 4 months. Somebody else offered $830, and they were paid cash, and they closed quickly and let the seller stay for 3 months for free. Is that house worth the $830 if the seller goes with that, but the $850 if they go with the other buyer? And so when that closes, it's either a comp at $850 or a comp at $830.
Huh. Yeah, that's a really good
Right?
point, yeah.
But the terms help determine the price, and that's not something that, it's not possible for them to look at that.
Right.
I'm not suggesting they do,
Yeah.
but that's sort of, again, the human element that's taken out of it.
Yeah,
When terms are really important
yeah, yeah.
and affect the value, affect the price that's going to sell for, therefore the value that's recorded, therefore the comps that exist.
Yeah, you could probably say that the terms affect the value of almost every property that sells, I would say, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yep, absolutely. I had one years ago where, there was a very, very relevant comp. Unfortunately, it was an appraiser who didn't know the area. There was a relevant comp that they totally ignored.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost the exact same square footage, it was exactly the same room count, very similar conditions, similar neighborhoods, and they just didn't use it. They used properties that weren't as relevant. As a result, the appraisal came in, about $30,000 under the agreed upon price, and the sellers needed to move on. So the buyer and seller renegotiated to a price in between. Now that in between price was the new comp for the next appraisers to use on the next sale, and so on and so on. So it's a snowball effect, and that closed sale price establishes itself as the value for the home that is used in future appraisals. So it's a really interesting process that, that one little omission, I will say, affected not just the sale of that property, but perhaps the sale of other properties, and so on, because it established a new fair market value
I was gonna
for
say, in a way,
that home.
it sort of affects the whole market.
It does.
Yeah.
So listen, I just want to say that this is not meant to bash appraisers. They have a very difficult job, and we cooperate and give them as much information as we possibly can.
Mhm.
When I always say, when an appraiser calls, before you call your parents back, your kids back, your best friend back, you call the appraiser back, because their job is very difficult, and we have a lot of information and a lot of insight that they don't necessarily have firsthand.
Right.
So we like to be helpful to them.
Yeah.
And there are times when we are able to refer business to them when an estate needs work done or whatever. There's some great appraisers out there, and we like working hand in hand with them. We really, there's some great appraisers out there who really know their stuff, and when they don't know something, they ask, and that's the most important thing, because none of us know everything in our business, right?
Yep, I think that's important to know.
Anyway, so thank you to all your hardworking appraisers, because we do appreciate what you do for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's it.
Yeah,
So
I
thank
think
you very much.
I think you answered every question that I had, so.
Great. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe to YouTube and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Take care.
Thank you.